Hello, everyone, and welcome to Beginnings, the show that asks, where do creative people come from? My name is Andy, the host of the show and a writer and performer based in Los Angeles, California. If you can hear the weariness in my voice, it is not because of today's guest, who is wonderful. It is obviously, if you're a listener to the show, I'm assuming we're somewhere in the same political area. So obviously, this whole week has been just a bunch of knives right in your butthole. So, but I'll tell you this, folks. I will tell you this, and I want a gold star from you, the audience, for this. I was waiting for this episode to mix down, and I was just fucking around online, and I went on Facebook. I'm not really on Facebook almost ever, except just to post podcast stuff. But I go on, I see this twerp from high school that I knew crowing about Trump's victory. He said, wait, let me see if I can find this, because I want to quote him exactly. Okay. He said, "It appears not everyone was fooled into believing Trump is a racist." I mean, look, there's plenty of reasons, none of them that I find compelling, to have voted for that piece of shit. But come on, own the fact that he is absolutely a racist. Going back to when him and his daddy would deny housing to black tenants. Just quick look this up. 1973 federal lawsuit brought against Donald Trump and his company for alleged racial discrimination. Just own it, you fucking coward. But I want the gold star because instead of writing just own it, you fucking coward, you little twerp, I did not. I chose not to engage in an online argument that would result in absolutely nothing. Would it have felt good? Maybe, but that's a small percentage of how we've gotten into this mess. Very small percentage, I would say 0.5%. That it feels good to scream at people online as opposed to having constructive conversations. Speaking of constructive conversations, what a constructive conversation I have today with my guest, John Pham. I have been a fan of John's comics for decades now. And if you don't know who John is, I'm going to read you his bio. So, here you go. Born in Saigon, cartoonist John Pham's family immigrated to the U.S. after the Vietnam War. In the year 2000, John received a self-publishing grant from the Zarek Foundation for his comic Epoxy. That's what I first read of his. It's wonderful. And later in the aughts, Fantagraphics published his books Sublife Volume 1 and 2, the latter of which was nominated for multiple Ignatz Awards. In between books, John works as an art director on some of your favorite cartoons, including Lucas Bros Moving Co., Axe Cop, and the new animated Everybody Still Hates Chris. His latest book, J plus K, was published by Fantagraphics in 2020, and a new paperback edition was released midsummer this year, and folks, it's terrific. I got it, and it's what made me think I should reach out to John, see if he wants to talk, and we get into it, talking about immigrating to the United States, which now in 2024 might feel like a mistake. Who knows? Talk about where John's family landed starting cartooning and what his parents thought of that. The answer might surprise you. Comics and morality. Why is there no Mad Men or Breaking Bad prestige drama version of some popular comics? A bunch of other stuff. John's a cool dude. I love his comics. And I hope you love this talk. Coming up on the show, some wonderful musicians, including Fred Thomas. That was a great talk. Brian Ennals and Infinity Knives, the duo behind one of my favorite hip-hop albums of the last couple years. So stay tuned for those, but for now, let's talk to John.
I can't help but notice your Guided by Voices cap and your Pavement print back there relating to good old like 90s indie rock. I discovered recently Lou Barlow and his wife's podcast. Have you heard of that?
No. Lou's been on the show before, but I didn't know that he had one.
Oh yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, you mentioned. Yeah. Yeah, it's a good one with his wife. I think her name is Adele, and they post fairly regularly. I guess he's on tour right now with Dinosaur Jr. and Weezer, and so he's just giving updates from the road, and it's really like entertaining and funny, and they're a married couple with kids, so I love, I always love listening to stories from people like that. But yeah, recommended. I don't think it's that popular. I don't think people have quite like discovered it yet. So it's kind of cool because of that reason.
Yeah. Hearing another married couple with kids in the arts is it speaks to your soul.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, it's like I mean, I'd imagine it's like when like a military vet or like a war vet like meets another one, like encounters another war vet, like randomly in life, and it's just like, oh, when did you serve? Like, were you in the shit? That kind of thing where it's like, oh yeah, hey, here's another creative. Yeah. So it's same energy for me.
Now, does the war analogy, is that an analogy to having children or an analogy to making art?
Oh man. I would say enlisting in the military is like making art, and then like actually serving in country is like having kids. So you're in the military, but now you're actually on the front line. So okay, so you're married. Yeah, you're married and you're in the arts, and now you have kids. So you're getting shot at every day.
Are you? I'm going to guess we're around the same age if we're into the same music, or somewhere around the same age.
Yeah, I was born in '74. I'm turning 50 this year, so definitely came of age. Like in this sort of like last days of like the LA punk scene before it became kind of like hair metal and then grunge or indie rock or whatever you want to call it. So yeah, those were my teen years.
Like going to punk shows like Black Flag, that kind of stuff?
I was too young to see Flag play or Black Flag, but I went to shows. There was a club out here called Jabberjaw that was, I guess, popular in the 90s. Missed Green Day by we went to the wrong address on Pico Boulevard to try to catch them. So missed them before they, I guess, exploded. But I think back when they were supporting, I think maybe their first album off of Lookout, I think was the label. But yeah.
You grew up here? You're from LA?
Yeah. I was born in Vietnam, and my family fled during the fall in '75, and I was only 6 months old when we came over here. So I don't really have any memory of the old country. But yeah, we settled in Jacksonville, Florida for a few years with a sponsor family. They helped us get on our feet. Really, cool pictures of my first birthday with my mom and me and my uncle, my dad, all eating pho, serving pho to our sponsor family, who all look like, and this is just my memory, maybe I'm exaggerating, but they all look like they're straight out of the movie Gummo. So it's kids, blonde kids with baseball jerseys, wide open, bare chested, just trying to figure out chopsticks and this weird noodle soup. And then other photos of them on their dirt bikes, motorbikes, jumping over just logs and stuff, and me in the background, a 1-year-old. So that was Jacksonville. And then we moved out to LA, I think in 80 or 79. Yeah, and have been here ever since.
Okay. So wait, sorry. I want to go back to this Harmony Korine family for a second. Because I'm trying to figure out the culture clash. How did they become a sponsor family in the first place?
The sponsorship program was set up through the Catholic Church, and I have to ask my uncle about this because I do need to fill in some of the details because it's fuzzy in my head. I think our sponsor family was a family that was in the church too, and they just volunteered to kind of take us in. And so they were really nice, Catholic folk. But they lived in Florida. They were Florida people in the 70s, and It was a different time, and we all, if you're from my generation, even like growing up in like the 80s, like, kids were just like more feral.
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
and so Harmony, like the like Gummo or kids even,
Hmm.
yeah, I think it speaks to that kind of like experience, like just growing up and just kind of exploring the world as a kid and as a teenager.
Yeah, yeah. I'm
Some,
slightly younger than you, but I caught like the tail end of that. There was still like it was my parents ended up being like halfway between helicopter parents and you're free to roam. And it was basically like you're free to roam up until 6 p.m. as long as we kind of know where you are. And that was like that's the helicopter ish part of it. But within
Mhm.
that space, as long as we kind of know where you are, was the neighborhood. So we could be anywhere in the neighborhood and that kind of free roaming. But we still had to kind of check in with them. But that
Oh
seems
yeah.
different from the 70s, from where every time I have guests on who were born, somewhere in the late 60s into the early 70s, it's more like, yeah, we just left and then we came back at some point and that was that. And it was very like in my mind it's always the ice storm. It's always just like this disconnect between parents and children.
Oh yeah. 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 Without the key parties, hopefully.
Well, sure. I
Yeah.
mean, without the rest
Yeah.
of the 70s stuff, but yeah.
No, it was a weird balance for me because it was definitely free range. It's as you described, like I just had to be back by dinner, but it was just out of necessity because my parents were just, always working, but they were also Asian parents. So they were like strict in their own way,
Mm.
but they just weren't around to always like enforce some of the strictness, especially my mom. My dad was a more like chill parent. So yeah, some of my happiest childhood memories are going with my dad to Orange County every weekend so that he could meet up with his old army buddies and play tennis and gamble. They'd play like a variation of like Pai Gow, like on the tennis courts. And then they'd eventually get kicked out of those public tennis courts by like I guess like Parks and Rec or the campus security because they'd be like, oh wait, it's a bunch of like old war vets like gambling and not playing tennis. Like we can't have this. But anyway, I would connect with a bunch of those other dads' kids, and like our dads would just be like, here's like $10, like just go and come back by sundown so that we can drive home. And we had absolute like just free reign to explore. I was in like Golden West, Westminster area.
What's that?
It's kind of near Huntington, Garden Grove. I mean, Orange County is kind of a big sprawl, but it's like kind of connected to like Anaheim.
Yeah, I vaguely know it.
Yeah, Little Saigon. Have you ever been to Little Saigon?
No, I've had guests. I've had guests from Vietnam who have grown up in the OC. Sorry to keep
Oh
calling it
yeah,
that.
yeah. Oh
So
no.
I kind of know, but I don't know much about it.
I guess the biggest kind of recognizable neighborhood would be like Huntington. But yeah, Westminster, Garden Grove is like the area that yeah, I kind of like grew up in and went to the mall, comic book shops,
Mhm.
toy stores, arcades, stuff like that. Yeah.
Was your family Catholic, or was it that the church was preying upon refugees?
I mean, it's like any other like colonial story, um, where I guess in Vietnam it was like French missionaries that came over and converted and proselytized, I guess is the word. So Catholicism was already kind of like a thing, the same way like French culture was a thing in Vietnam by that time. I
Right.
mean, you could see examples of it with like food and cuisine. It's like banh mi. Banh mi is like French baguette and stuff. It just wove into Vietnamese culture. My dad grew up like speaking French because they taught it to him in school. So yeah, the whole Catholicism thing. My mom was more of a, practicing Catholic than my dad was. So she was the one that would, have us go to church on Sundays whenever we could go. And I ended up going to Catholic schools for a lot of my life, or at least like, private, I guess, Christian denomination schools. Yeah.
How religious? I mean, I guess when I ask this question, I'm breaking it with a parenthetical because I really just want to get to the meat of it, which is more about faith. I'm always curious about my guests, like how much they felt this stuff or how much it was just a thing imposed upon them that they had to do. Because I had friends growing up who had to go to CCD. They had to go to CCD. They had to go to church. They got confirmed or whatever. Holy Communion, that kind of. Sorry, I'm Jewish, so I'm just like I'm grabbing as many terms as I can remember. But like they didn't feel it. It wasn't in their bones. And I'm always curious about whether it's just a thing you had to do or whether it's a thing you felt. And if so, if that affected your life, if it, in either way, I guess.
Yeah, it's definitely something to think about. It's something I've been thinking about recently with my own kids, and in terms of like, oh, how do we sort of, it's not even like, how do you indoctrinate them? Because my wife and I are not like practicing, we're not, religious in any sort of formal way. But then the kids will always come to you with like these really big questions. And then they hear about other, kids who are maybe a bit more formally religious. As far as myself, yeah, it's weird. It's like I was always kind of like bored by the trappings of like Catholicism. Like going to mass every Sunday was such a chore. All the things that you had to do as a Catholic growing up, confirmation, like you mentioned, first communion, baptism. The church, was always so hot in the summer. It was just like, why am I here? Sometimes I would take naps in the pews, big no. But yeah, it's interesting. It's like there's some of it though, like it's because you get taught like, some of the morality, or you get taught a lot of the morality, or at least I did, like from like the earliest age. It's like my mom would just like be like, hey, these are things you don't do. These are things you should do. This is how you should behave. This is what you should believe in. And that stuff is like free of like formal religion. It's just like your mom like kind of teaching you like morals and ethics.
Yeah.
And then it's like you realize, oh yeah, that was like, from a Catholic sort of point of view or something. It reminds me of this book. It's called The Hunger of Memory. I think the author's name is Richard Rodriguez.
Mm-hmm.
And he talks about like his upbringing, because I think he's of Mexican descent. And so he grew up like hardcore Catholic, but then, he's like an academic, kind of was able to like rationalize himself out of a lot of like that indoctrination. He understands the history of like, the missionaries and all that stuff. But then he mentions like you don't shed that like those teachings or that belief system or that value system like you do like an outfit or like clothing.
Right.
It's like it's hard to kind of like figure out where like those like teachings begin, or where those teachings like end and where you begin. It's like it's so like woven. Maybe it is in our bones, maybe it is in our DNA, like some of these like religious things that we're taught as kids, but then as we grow up and we go to college or something, it's like, oh yeah, religion's kind of silly. But how much of it is kind of stuck inside of you?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say struggle. That's maybe not the word that I want to use. I waver back and forth about how much of it is how much of my own moral system is just something I was taught and I follow it because I was taught it, and how much of it is meaningful to me, or what is meaningful to me. Because a lot of it is based on like obeying authority just for authority's sake, but also a lot of it is good, I think, and meaningful, such as like don't kill people, right? Full
Sure.
stop, right? For its own sake. And my whole life has been about trying to unweave the following authority for authority's sake part of it, which I don't know how much it comes from religion and how much of it comes from being raised in Reagan's America, right? Come from like, being indoctrinated with capitalism and being indoctrinated with a kind of belief system where you are supposed to just kind of blindly follow what you're told to do. And I don't mean that in a I mean that coming from a left-wing perspective, by the way, not a just so you're clear. I'm not about
Sure.
like in 10 minutes I'm not going to be like, and then anyway, then there all these celebrities are drinking adrenochrome. Like I'm not it's just
I
so
hope
we're
not.
clear. Just
Yeah.
you're like,
I didn't realize
like,
it would be that. Yeah. I didn't
just so
realize it
we're
would be that kind of podcast.
yeah, just
But
so we're
no,
clear
I
where
get
I'm
it.
coming from. But yeah.
No, I feel similar. I feel similarly. No, it's and also like growing up in that era, like the Reagan era, when like media for kids was a very certain way. Like, Optimus Prime taught you like not to, yeah, freedom's the right of whatever. Reading comics too, like going from daily newspaper, because my introduction to comics was daily newspaper strips, like humor, like
Yeah.
gag stuff. But then
Beetle
as
Bailey,
Beetle Bailey, Garfield,
Broomhilda.
Peanuts, Broomhilda. Yeah, reading the LA Times, it was like whatever was in, the comics section there, and then going to the library as well. But then, superhero comics had their own sort of way to like teach kids about justice and morality, which was really weird, but which kind of, but it also kind of sticks with you in odd ways.
Yeah.
Getting taught by the media as well, like cartoons and comics. So
It's funny. Maybe that's not the best word. Maybe eerie, spooky, something like that. The propaganda value of superheroes. It's one thing when it was the 1980s and, left politics was not easily accessible unless you had a library card or were kind of, raised in maybe San Francisco or something like that. But now that anyone can kind of, read Noam Chomsky or someone like that, and you can kind of start pulling the stuff apart, it's really interesting reading superhero comics and seeing the contradictions laid bare, and they can't really handle it because in one sense, the superheroes are supposed to stand for liberty and justice. And on the other hand, that they are constantly fighting to stop small crimes, and they're ostensibly on the side of the cops
yeah,
and
Law and Order.
on Law and Order, which we've seen now is, especially with the way that, again, sorry, I'm going to tip into, this is going to sound, there's plenty of government documents and other things. If you listen to David Sirota's Master Plan podcast, you know, there's documentation, but over the last 40, 50 years, the Federalist Society and there have been concerted efforts to enshrine political corruption into law so that it's easier to and the way that the Supreme Court has been built over the last. So I'm being inarticulate, but I'm just saying that the system itself over the last 40, 50 years has kind of been corrupted, and we're kind of living in that world now. And yet the propaganda we read is breaking under the weight of the contradiction between those things. But when we were kids, it was just like, oh yeah, they're stopping a robbery. Spider-Man stopping a robbery. That's good.
You know what though? I do think it's because maybe a lot of those writers and artists, like we can give them more credit, because like what I got from even like the lamest superhero comics was just more like blanket morality stuff, like, hey, we're all equal no matter what what background we are, and even cops could be corrupt. Like those Batman comics where Gordon, Commissioner Gordon is the only like honest cop, and he's only got like a few other ones who are honest too, and everyone else is. It's like that stuff kind of like opens your eyes as a kid, like, oh yeah, there's more stuff happening behind the veil. But there's limitations to that kind of like storytelling too, and that kind of that format, because those comics, they got to be code approved and parent approved.
Yeah.
But at least it was it was a gateway for me, at least, to like I remember reading Undergrounds for the first time. I think it was like maybe my sophomore year in high school. So yeah, I mean, just finding like a copy of Weirdo at the local comic shop, where I was like looking for. I was so sick and tired of superhero comics at that point, I think I just naturally, like was ready for something like Weirdo or Love and Rockets or,
Yeah.
Eight Ball
Yeah.
at that point.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't encounter that stuff until later and realized that it was filling in that hole that I was looking for. Like where I wanted something sophisticated. I wanted there to be weirdness and adult sophistication to these
Mhm.
very simple morality tales. And I wasn't getting them from, as much as I love the X-Men, I wasn't getting it from the X-Men. It was just people fighting, and then there's just evil. There's just capital E evil. The Shadow King, whatever.
Sure. And for me too, it was also, and I remember too, like I remember exactly where I just like hit a point of fatigue. It was, I think it was called the Atlantis Attacks
Yes.
crossover event. Uh, and it was just, as a reader too, I was like, what is all this like all these comics I have to keep track of? It's a huge event. It doesn't, there's nothing like really interesting happening in it. I'm so bored by all these stories. And yeah, at that point I was just ready to, you know, to kind of like move on, I think. So it was the industry too. It was like, superhero comics, moving towards that like 90s like speculator boom. Because I think right when that happened, like, Jim Lee working on like X-Men or,
Yeah.
or relaunching X-Men, that was when I was already out. I think those are how I think hopefully the dates line up. But that's how it kind of works out in my memory.
Yeah. Yeah. That was like, I was still a kid then. Those are like my prime years. What?
Yeah, and for me, I was like a teen, and fully like in that angsty, I think music wise too, I was like, listening to more, angst friendly music. And the comics I was reading weren't like lining up with that. I think that's another thing is like I was listening to The Cure, The
Aha.
Smiths,
Aha.
um, like all, whatever punk bands. I think Minor Threat was like on my radar. So it's like, how can I, have this part of my brain sort of like developing in that way and still like reading Atlantis Attacks? It's like, it just
Right.
wasn't, yeah, this is too scrambled.
Yeah. 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 So, okay. So you grow up Catholic. It's kind of boring. It gives you some sense of morality. Is there any connection to the divine in you, or is it all just like spiritually dead?
I mean, the cynical, like, knee-jerk answer would be, yeah, I'm spiritually dead, but
I
I
mean, me
hope
too.
not.
This is not a judgment.
It's weird. It's like having kids really does, it kind of forces you to, question like your core beliefs. It sort of forces you to be hopeful despite yourself. Because then why have kids? And if everything's going to go bad, then, like why sort of teach them anything or instill any hope in them? And it's also like my own personal experience. It's like, you know, as Vietnamese refugees, like we went through our own sort of apocalyptic event. It's like you can't get much more like world ending than that. Like your own country, your home, everything you knew, all the people you knew, like taken away, like just violently and suddenly, and then having like no idea what your life is going to be like on the other side of that. Like that's a very sort of, you know, personal apocalypse for us. And my parents were able to get through it. They were able to find some sort of like hope. Obviously, they didn't come out on the other side like fully, unscathed. There's a lot of PTSD and a lot of like, health stuff that they had to deal with, because of that experience. But
Do you mean mental health stuff?
mental health and physical health too. Yeah. Because they both got sick, stress related stuff. But yeah, like, I mean, it's stuff that we're all dealing with now as a generation. Like what's happening to our planet, like on an ecological sort of level, with climate change, what's happening to our country politically. There's all these like really kind of, I mean, there's just an ambient sort of anxiety that we're all dealing with on a daily basis because of those things that we're having to think about and worry about. But it makes me, kind of, yeah, it 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 helps put it in perspective for me, just like remembering where we came from, and that, there's, even if the world like sort of goes to shit like ecologically, there's, life will, like, if society collapses,
Mhm.
the grass is going to keep growing, like trees, maybe new species of animals will evolve. After extinction level events, there's always, like,
Sure. I mean,
it's,
the planet will survive. We
yeah,
probably the animal life, including us at the moment, probably will not.
or at least like, small segment of the population. But that's the thing. It's like, I don't know. There's only some things you can kind of control. The other stuff you got to just do what you can, and deal with the problems that are right in front of you. And you can't let all that sort of ambient anxiety, steal too much of your daily joy.
Yeah. Do you get that from your parents? Do you get that sense of, well, I can't just feel despair in the face of, this global altering event that we're all probably going to face in our lifetimes.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, just through example, like they went through it, and I have no memory of that either. It's like just from stories that they told me,
Right.
and then they just came over to this country, and were able to claw their way back up to, like the working class and the middle class, and still have fun, and still give, my brother and I have one sibling,
Mm-hmm.
they're still able to give us a decent life, and enough money for me to buy toys and comics, and you know become a cartoonist. So yeah, it's just through example more than anything. Even though, like, if you were to talk to them, they would just be like, oh yeah, it was hard, it's still hard. They're not with us anymore. Like, my mom passed away in 2005, my dad in 2000. um and that's because of those health related reasons
Mm-hmm.
that I mentioned.
What were their lives like in Vietnam? Do you know?
Oh yeah, just from their stories, and also, like, I keep in touch with some of their friends from that generation. But yeah, my dad served in the South Vietnamese Army, the ARVN, and I think he was a before he was discharged, he was like an officer. He was in the officer class. God, I gotta ask my uncle again what rank. But he got injured. He had like a mortar injury to his head.
Ugh.
Yeah, and got discharged, and then just was a civilian, I think, for the last few years before we had to flee, and had a good job. And my mom was just a stay-at-home mom, when I was born. They were definitely like middle class. So yeah, had a decent life, And luckily my dad wasn't like serving right up until the fall. He,
Mm.
was able to kind of like just be like a regular civilian. And I think it gave us time to kind of prepare, and like flee when we had to.
So wait, he wanted to go into the military like when he was done with school. I'm assuming it's the same kind of system where you don't join the military until you're at least out of school.
I believe so. Yeah, he went to Fort Benning
Mm-hmm.
out here. Like, he was part of like some exchange or like military education program. And I have to ask like one of his old army buddies about more details, but I think the war was happening, was just beginning, and maybe like the US needed, better like sort of like translators or something. And so
Mm-hmm.
he came out here to Fort Benning, and studied, I think, for like a year or two, and then went back to Vietnam. So I can't, I'll have to ask too if it was like mandatory sort of like conscription, or if he did it out of choice.
Yeah.
I always thought it was like by choice, from what I remember.
When you say the start of the war, do you mean like the American phase, or do you mean like the French phase?
The American phase,
Okay.
late 60s, mid or late 60s. Yeah. I don't know.
Okay.
My dates might be totally wrong. It's been a long
Sure.
time. Yeah. And my dad, he's he passed away a while ago, so I need to recheck my facts.
Sure. I'm fuzzy on it too. I'm like, French phase is like the 1950s into the 60s, and then America decides to fight communism.
Yeah. I think in the late 60s. I'll have to recheck.
Listeners, you can assume that there was a deep eye roll along when I said fight communism.
I know, yeah, it's shameful. I should have those dates and
No.
all the milestones sort of better memorized. But it's been a
Unless, you,
while.
unless you're a scholar, you kind of just need to vaguely know these things.
Yeah, it's tough too not having the parents around, so it's like those stories don't get, retold. But yeah, it's my responsibility to because my kid is asking me a lot of these questions now too, so I got to review a lot of it.
Did you see The Sympathizer at all?
I haven't. I haven't.
It's great.
Oh, okay, good. Good. Yeah, my wife was trying to get me to like audition because they were having all these like open casting calls around here. Like, we need a Vietnamese man who could speak Vietnamese, like in their like, mid to late 40s. And my wife's like, "That's you, go." I'm like, no, not good in front of the camera. But it's good, right?
Yeah, it was really, really good. I really liked it. But it also like it shows the expatriate community here in Los Angeles. And I was going to ask if you had seen it, if that was accurate in any way, or if it was, it's when you said Little Saigon, I'm kind of curious. What was your experience growing up there in the OC? Sorry that I keep calling that just because the TV show.
Oh no, no,
Instead of
it's all
Orange
right. I mean,
County.
it's so funny. Like, yeah, like growing up, all my relatives just called it Santa Ana. Like, I think colloquially, like all Vietnamese
Mhm.
people were like, "Oh yeah, you're going to Santa Ana," but like in Vietnamese. But you're not in Santa Ana. You're like technically in another. Santa Ana is like a whole other like region or neighborhood. But yeah, I would go down there on the weekends. So it was like weekdays were here in LA, like Hollywood area or like Mid Wilshire,
Mhm.
and then weekends were in Orange County, near Little Saigon. So like on Saturdays, I'd go there with my dad so he could play tennis and gamble with his army buddies.
Right,
And
right.
then on Sundays, I would go there with my mom who had to do her shopping at like the, Vietnamese supermarkets or whatever. And it was amazing. It was awesome. It was like the greatest, sort of childhood I could ask for because yeah, we were free range. I made friends, one of my best friends who I still I'm still in touch with. Uh, I would, spend the weekend with him during the summers. I would do like a week long sleepover at his house. I mean, that's how close we were. And yeah, it was amazing. Like, summer movies. And it was the 80s, so it's all these great movies for kids like my age. Like you're watching Ghostbusters or Aliens or Dragnet. Dragnet's not talked about enough, but the Dragnet movie with Dan Aykroyd and Tom Hanks, I
Oh, I
remember
remember.
distinctly. Oh, okay. I remember loving that. And going to the comic book shop, going to the arcade. There were great arcades around us. Yeah, it was all you could ask for.
Are there any tensions between Vietnamese culture and American culture when you're growing up, or does it kind of seamlessly interweave together?
Oh no, there's tension everywhere. I mean, there's internal tension, like, in speaking for myself, there's cultural tension too. Like, I remember, I mean, the most racist, like, sort of encounters or experiences I had were in Orange County, like, you know,
Mm,
because, there a lot of parts of that area are like notoriously conservative, and Huntington Beach is, always in the news for being kind of crazy in their own sort of right-wing way. But yeah, like the worst. And it's also like in the 80s too is when the Vietnamese community really started to like boom,
mm,
and Little Saigon really started to establish itself and expand, like just a hardcore ethnic enclave. You drive around down there now and you see billboards and street signs that are only in Vietnamese, and city council like candidates flags or like lawn signs that are just Vietnamese people. And I can only imagine if you were like a white person that grew up in that neighborhood, and all of a sudden there's all these people sort of taking over the businesses. Yeah, I mean, I'm not excusing it, but putting yourselves in those shoes, it's like you either go with it, like, oh yeah, this is great, this is enriching the community, and these people seem nice, for the most part. or you could just kind of be like, oh man, what's happening in my neighborhood, what's happening in my country.
What's happening in my neighborhood? I'm getting all this delicious food that was never here before.
Cheap too,
That's
but
that. See that? Look, on every level, on every on every level, and this is not. Look, I'm not going out on a limb to say racism is inexcusable, but especially when it comes to food, where it's like, oh, my shitty American cuisine is now I have all these other choices of incredible, delicious food to choose from. Inexcusable on just that
yeah,
very level, along
yeah.
with all the other stuff.
You would think. I mean, you're speaking from a place of logic, but it's rarely logical. Yeah, and it's a lot of services too. Like my mom went into manicuring, like doing nails, she became a beautician. So a lot of these immigrants end up doing the work that maybe a lot of like natives or you know, I guess middle class people are less likely to do or don't want to do unless you pay them a lot.
Sure.
So yeah, so like becoming a manicurist, it's like they were able to like charge way less because it's like who wants to be touching feet all day or working with chemicals and stuff. It's the same thing with like being like opening up a laundromat or something. So a lot of these like immigrants were doing very low paying work or
Mm-hmm.
services, and they were able to charge less because I don't know, for whatever economic reason they were able to keep their overhead low. But yeah, maybe that caused a lot of resentment too.
In terms of belief systems, though, does it weave? Does Vietnamese culture, at least the Vietnamese culture you grew up with, does that weave seamlessly with American culture in the late 70s, early 80s? Or are there, because like American culture, the culture I grew up with that I'm now, in my adulthood, just kind of, I was going to say dismantling, but just, evaluating and seeing just how kind of psychopathic it was as we got into the Reagan era and neoliberalism for real,
Hmm.
like the whole Wall Street ethos.
Yeah,
Were
greed is
there
good.
were there tensions there in terms of the belief system, or was it just like, no, this is, hey, we're here, and whatever kind of beliefs we're bringing with us, they're now subordinated to American beliefs.
It's a good question. It's nothing. I mean, it's nothing I ever really question. It's just something you sort of, as a kid, you just accept. Like this is what life is like. You notice that like your parents are sort of arguing or fighting over money a lot. But from my memory and from my point of view, like one of my earliest memories of going to see a movie was going with my uncle to see Scarface, the Al Pacino Scarface.
Yeah,
I think I was like 8,
that's
and
very young to see
it,
Scarface.
it's a gnarly movie, but it's a classic. I mean, there's a reason why that movie is like revered among rappers and also Vietnamese people of the era because it's the American dream. It's like the most like insane sort of example of the American dream, that you can I guess like think of as a work of fiction because
Mm,
it's just super exaggerated and he's a criminal. But it's a story of a guy who came from a different country, barely spoke the language, had nothing, and became, the king of the world.
mm-hmm.
And there was a tragedy to it too, but I think it resonated with a lot of like immigrants and also like people like rappers and stuff because it's like, hey, there's possibilities in this country, and that's what was sort of like instilled in the Vietnamese, I guess, community that came over. It's like, hey, we got nothing, but let's open up like a nail salon. Let's do this. Let's do that. And it's the Reagan years, so there's money like flowing everywhere, or there's money to be made. Cost of living isn't so bad. That's another huge factor too. Is like you could buy a house back then on the money you made as a manicurist or as like the owner of a manicure shop,
Right.
and like maybe have some money left over to buy like a Cadillac. So I think it was that. It's like I think a lot of the people in the community were caught up in the whole like, let's maybe cover up our trauma and the pain that we went through, like leaving our country by just
Uh-huh.
like this whole casino mindset. Because I don't think it's any coincidence either that a lot of Vietnamese people love, love to gamble. It's maybe it's a cultural thing too. It's like, Asian country, like having connections with like mainland China. It's like, Pai Gow and a lot of those that kind of games. Vietnamese people love to gamble, and there's nothing more exciting than like the sort of like gambling with your life and and opening a business and like getting seeing all that money come in and buying a house and buying some nice cars and stuff and maybe it is covering up a little bit of the pain of having to you know
Yeah.
lose your country and come and start over in a new country.
Yeah. Especially, I mean, is there any resentment that, I mean, I know your dad was trained by the United States, but is there any resentment in that, in moving to the country that was partially responsible for forcing you, like, do you know what I mean? Forcing you to have to leave your home country in the first place?
I mean, not from my memory and not from, the stories that my dad told. Like in his mind, everything could be blamed on the communists.
Sure.
It was all like, the communist regime's fault. The US was, just an ally and they took us in. I don't remember too much talk of like resentment for our host country, but he did, like mention to me like, hey, we're here, we're sort of like we're different from people who were born here just by the color of our skin, but also like culturally and where we came from, and we didn't become citizens until I was like a teenager. Like I don't think my parents weren't. I get is the process like naturalization when you go from like having like a green card to becoming a citizen. Like they didn't go through that until I think I was like 18.
Mm.
And then I in turn became a citizen because they were. So yeah, they there wasn't resentment to the country. There wasn't like, you know, too much like over the top gratitude either, but there was like a sense of gratitude, but then also like an awareness that we're different and, we didn't quite 100% belong.
I mean, how does all of this coalesce in your head? Because on one end you have Scarface, right? On the other end, you have The Smiths or Minor Threat. You have superhero comics, but you also have whatever, Charles Burns or whatever kind of like R. Crumb. I don't know, whatever kind of underground. You have these kind of competing things, and for me, the weirder stuff, the more left political stuff, that won out because it felt more real to me. It felt more like my lived experience in America. And so I naturally started to gravitate towards that end of things. And then, that just snowballs into the person I am now. And I'm kind of curious, how do those two ends of this, whatever, moral and political spectrum, how do they played out in you?
Yeah. Well, at the time it was like linear. It was like, oh
Mm,
yeah, hey, I'm a kid and these are what the things I'm experiencing as a kid. And as you're going through like those stages of development, those things, I mean, Scarface is like an aberration because
sure.
it was like this weird like adult thing that got that traumatized me as a child. But yeah, other like cartoons or whatever are things that you sort of consume as a kid, but then you outgrow them. And I think as I was coming of age, it was like just typical angst, those like teenage years that you're that everyone experiences. The pop music, listening to like JJ Fad or Michael Jackson or something, just for some reason wasn't doing it for me. And so you just naturally like seek out like what maybe could speak to you and comfort you better as you're going through these things
Mm,
internally. And so yeah, that's how I sort of, so it's linear. So it's like you go from like superheroes to like the undergrounds, like luckily, and it is just pure dumb luck. It's like
yeah.
I'm in a comic book shop, and I think I was like looking through, or I was looking for issues of Alien Legion,
Hmm.
because that was sort of like, okay, I can't do superheroes. What's this weird like kind of sci-fi comic, Alien Legion? That's kind of cool. And then I just happened to find a copy of Weirdo, and I was like, what is this? Like, and through there, or after that, it was kind of like Love and Rockets, Eight Ball, especially Eight Ball,
Yeah.
and on and on and on. And then like, going finishing high school, going through college, and kind of, entering like early adulthood. Like these are things that happen like linearly.
Mm.
But then maybe after like a certain age, maybe after like my mid 20s or something, you could just kind of like re-examine like, oh yeah, this stuff that I kind of consumed as a kid, I wonder if there's any value. I wonder if it like holds up. So you kind of like revisit it. But yeah, some of it does hold up, some of it doesn't. I can still kind of enjoy Garfield, but I definitely can 100% really engage with Peanuts. Like to me, Peanuts still holds up,
Yeah.
and it's something I can read as an adult, and it's something that I really loved as a kid too. But superhero comics, a lot of it I just can't reread, but some of it I can. Like some of it, there's like some of the John Byrne
Hmm.
Fantastic Fours, those early issues, to me are still readable. So yeah, it's a linear thing, the first time you go through it, and then only after you get to a certain kind of like age can you kind of like look at it, as a whole.
Yeah. I mean, it's tough. It's just that like a lot of superhero stuff, I yearn for it to have the sophistication of Mad Men or some kind of whatever prestige TV show. Pick your favorite one. I want it to have that kind of adult, and I don't mean like The Boys where it's like ultra violence and we're, we it's actually a satire of corporate culture or whatever, right? I mean, like, I want them to have adult emotions and adult feelings, and I don't think at least the ones that come out of, Marvel and DC, there are certainly some great writers that can tell great stories, but I just think that it is the thing that maybe satisfied me when I was a kid.
Mhm.
As an adult, I know too much about the world for it to resonate.
Well, that's the key, right? Are you talking about trying to read like contemporary superhero
Yeah, like
comics nowadays?
whatever. X-Men. I really like a lot of the people that have written X-Men. Al Ewing and Kieran Gillen,
Sure.
But
Yeah.
also they just
Jonathan Hickman, right?
yeah,
Wasn't he one of the, yeah.
yeah. But it was essentially they created a fascist state.
Oh yeah.
The last like 5 or 6 years was we start our own nation. There's no democratically elected officials. It's run by a council of 12 that have no accountability,
No checks and balances.
no checks and balances. Half of the people on this council are murderers and everyone's been given asylum.
Yeah.
And
I
I just sorry, it's just like it just rings so false these days. But anyway,
Yeah, you're talking about the Krakoa stuff.
yeah,
I haven't read any of that. I've only like heard about it, or seen like social media stuff, and it seems interesting. Like my thing, and I think maybe this is, and I don't want to speak for you, but I feel like the it's like an obvious problem that I think a lot of people have talked about, but it's like we're adults now, we're of a certain age. Now we're trying to find like the sort of like satisfaction or like intellectual nourishment that we got from these comics, from this genre, that we got when
yeah,
we were like that we got when we were 9. I was like the heaviest I'd gotten into superhero comics was in 85, or the beginning of it was 85. And it was like a 5-year period. Like I was able to kind of like track it and map it out. So from 85 to like 90. So that means I was like 9 to like 14. And I feel like they were perfect for me, like around that age. Because, I was like a, 9-year-old boy, hormones are starting to kick in. You're trying to like figure out like, your place in the world, or like at least get some sort of like idea or information about the world, and maybe like ethics or whatever. And yeah, and it ran its course. And now as like a, old man, it's like I can't imagine, yeah, it giving me the same sort of like, you know,
yes,
the
No,
same value as it did when I was like a teenager.
yeah. No, you're right. I think the thing that I'm look, that would be the ideal is like someone makes a prestige version of this, the Mad Men version, the Sopranos version, whatever, right? Where it's sophisticated on that level. I don't necessarily need that, but I would like something that's morally correct. And I don't know if it's just that I've drifted to the left enough or I know enough about how our political system works where and I'm only thinking this because we got onto this kind of like talk of morality and how morality was instilled in us.
Mm-hmm.
And seeing when I was a kid, it was simple. And it was, yes, we're on the side of the cops and we're fighting for justice. And, it was all these kind of like justice in capital letters type stuff. Growing up in the wake of Watergate and the 70s and all this kind of stuff, I think, because it wasn't, I think comics maybe was probably more disillusioned in the 70s. But as an adult, I at least want some kind of like clear morality, if anything. Or thinking about kids reading it, where they're like, yeah, they formed their own nation and they're all fascist. And the kid doesn't know that. They just think that it's okay to have undemocratically elected officials.
Are kids reading a lot of that Krakoa stuff, or are they mostly
That's a good
reading?
question.
I think they're mostly reading manga, or they're reading like those young adult, like, Scholastic or First Second
That's
comics.
a good question. Well, in that case, then cater to the adult. If
Yeah.
kids aren't reading it,
And they're trying.
here's the thing though. How did your ambitions form in all of this to make comics? And was there any pushback from your parents?
Somewhere along the line, like drawing and doodling. I remember checking out a book at the library that was like how to draw, like the world's most, beloved comic strip characters. So it's like how to draw Garfield, how to draw, if I can remember correctly, Tintin, Hi and Lois, just a bunch of like classic
Yeah.
comic strip characters, and just like practicing with that and getting a lot of support from my parents. My parents were they luckily they weren't super hardcore about me being like a doctor or a lawyer. I think it just early on they were just, yeah, they would tell me like, hey, we just want you to be happy, just do whatever makes you happy, because my mom was like a manicurist and my dad worked through different careers. And I think with like in Vietnamese culture too, there's like there's we're not a monolith. There's like such a variety of like, oh yeah, some parents are like, hey, you got to be a doctor, but others are just like, hey, if you want to be a blue collar like type, then do that, but maybe open your own business so that you can be comfortable. So there wasn't a whole lot of pressure for me to have like an amazing career. So they were always super, super supportive of like all the, creative stuff I was doing, whether it was doodling, art projects, or, whatever. And it wasn't until 99 when I applied for the Xeric grant. It was the first comic I had ever done. And yeah, it wasn't until then that like it became sort of like real, like it became maybe a sort of, career option.
In getting the grant or in applying? Like at what point do you think it, was it when you applied was just like, yeah, sure, I'll try this. And then getting it kind of solidified that, or was in applying for it, you already were like, well, I want this to be my direction in life.
Applying for it, I think, was because I'd wanted to do comics. I think just for as far back as I can remember. Reading comics, I think it just became a sort of like truth to me. Like, yeah, I want to do this. This is a dream for me. And then, hearing about the award was sort of like the, main like motivating factor to kind of finally do it. Because up until then, I'd never done like minis or anything like that. I just couldn't see myself like it didn't feel like enough of like a I guess like validation to just like zero. Because as a kid, I'd done like tiny little like thumbnail comics.
Even though you
So
grew up in the age of zines and things like that.
yeah. For some reason, just doing like a zine didn't feel like enough of a challenge. Maybe it's a challenge, And I think, like having the Xeric, having it like professionally printed, and being able to take an ad out in I think I took an ad out in the Comics Journal and then maybe one other publication because the Xeric gave you that budget to like do advertisements. That to me was like, oh yeah, this is legitimizing. So the Xeric was like really important for that. And my parents were like, beyond proud and beyond stoked for
Yeah.
me when that happened. So yeah, I've been lucky. They'd always been, supportive and just like, just the right amount of pressure. Like, hey, pick something, do something with your life. Like, you can't live at home forever.
So as long as you had a direction, they were happy.
Yeah, yeah. And like any typical Vietnamese my mom was happy for me to like live at home for as long as necessary. I think culturally, it's like the joke is like the kids stay at home until they get married,
Mm.
and they're supposed to live at home so that they can save up enough money to buy, their own house with their spouse
Yeah.
when they get married. So I could stay with my mom for as long as, you
Yeah.
know, needed.
When you start making comics, is it difficult to make a living? Because this is what you're the early 2000s.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's like, I mean, unless you're, part of that sort of rarefied, like small percent, it's pretty difficult. I was making money doing illustration and just random like projects that would come down the pike. Like I remember doing like an educational comic. It was more like on spec. It was a propose like a comics proposal for PBS, and that brought in money. But yeah, it wasn't until I started working in
Mm.
animation where I realized, oh yeah, this is a career where I can actually make a living, and then the comics will just have to be a sort of like side
Yeah.
hustle.
I mean, you grow up in LA, so I assume that showbiz has to be there at least on your radar as a possibility, working whether it's storyboards or actually animating or whatever, right? Character design. There's so much open to you if you have any kind of artistic prowess, right?
Yeah, well, at the time, it really wasn't. It seemed like those, two worlds were hermetically sealed off from each
Huh.
other, like comics and animation, to me at least. I didn't really know anyone that worked in animation, and I guess that's like the key, like just having people that who you could ask for work or could recommend you or who could think about you. And that didn't happen. That situation didn't happen until I think like 2000 and maybe 9 or 10 when Ben Jones of like Paper Rat
Mm.
fame, he moved to LA to work on his show. And just through, friends of friends, Sammy Harcum, like we
Oh yeah.
both knew Sammy. Yeah, Ben. Yeah, I met Ben that way, and he kept me in mind as someone who could help him work on the show or help him make the show. And yeah, that was my first animation job. It was for a show called Problem
Yeah.
Solvers.
It's interesting. I knew this in the back of my head, but until you said it, I didn't realize just how I don't even know how to say this. How many connections there are between
Hmm.
alt comics and animation. Cartoon Network
Hmm.
and that like there's so many people that I've talked to on this show that are also and I'm also working animation.
Hmm.
It just I don't
Yeah.
I don't have anything interesting to say. I just I just
Oh no, no, no. It's totally, I mean, that's just I think it's been like that for, well, I mean, the way it is now with like, indie cartoonists like working on like Adventure Time or like regular show, those Cartoon Network shows. Like that feels like a new sort of
Mhm.
development where a lot of like creator driven cartoons were looking for like weirdos like me to like give flavor to their shows. But even like way back in the heyday of animation, I guess like the 30s, and maybe like earlier, like the 20s. And I'd have to get my dates more like accurate on this, but there's a lot of cross pollination too between like people who were working in like the newspaper strip world or in like the floppy comics world, and like the Disney animation studios at the time, or like Fleischer. So yeah, I think it's something that's people, anyone who's like proficient in like the cartooning language theoretically can kind of go back and
I
forth,
see.
but it's about, yeah, it's about your I guess like kind of your personal network and also like what what seems to be trendy in the
Yeah.
industry at that
But also
moment,
the skill, because it always struck me as strange when like the weirdos from whatever, whether it's comics or whether it's from comedy, are then hired on a quote unquote normal show. Like the
Mhm.
Tonight Show hoovered up all the weird comics in New York, yet it was producing fairly mainstream content, or it does produce fairly mainstream. It's not like they're doing strange, alienating, surreal comedy on the Tonight Show. It is fairly, we're playing games. I guess I don't really watch it, but from what I've seen clips of, right, they play, Jimmy Fallon plays games with the
Yeah,
guests and things like that. And this is not to impugn that, not to impugn any of the writers, but it's just, it always struck me as
yeah,
strange that you would hire the weirdest people who are genuinely weird, not just like
yeah,
putting it on as a suit, to write, the most normal show in the world.
yeah, yeah. No, I mean, it maybe it shows that their intentions were right, and that the plan was maybe to go like late night with David Letterman, like levels
Mm,
of weirdness, and you know what
yeah.
I mean? Because I mean his show like proved that you could, and even Conan like proved that you can go pretty weird with like a mainstream like late night show. But maybe something happened along the
But
way.
those were
There's
those were
gatekeepers.
12:30. So here's the thing though. Those were 12:30 shows,
Yeah,
and where you could kind of get away. Once I think Letterman was at 11:30, I think it was
yeah.
kind of more normal then.
Oh yeah, yeah. But still retained a lot of its,
Yeah.
DNA.
But did you ever feel like there was tension between whatever weirdness you felt or wanted to express as an artist, and then having to work in, you know, you are subject to someone else's, if you're working for a showrunner or someone like that, right? You still have to like deliver what they
Hmm.
want or what the industry wants, which is usually
Hmm.
more conservative. Did you ever feel tension between those two things?
Luck. Well, maybe in the beginning when you're kind of more naive and you're way more insecure, where you're just kind of trying to find your sort of place in this new environment, this new world, and you're just like maybe more hypersensitive about, critique or notes or having to follow the leader. But luckily, I had like my own sort of like practice, my own like, like outlet. And it had already been going. It was already sort of
Uh-huh.
like, happening. So I could just like compartmentalize that way.
Oh.
And it's still something I'm learning. I mean, it's not, I don't have all the answers. But it's really funny. Like I think maybe last year or 2 years ago, I had this revelation. Maybe it was also having a kid, and like my oldest is 7
Oh
now,
wow.
and he's starting to get really curious about sports, and so I'm having to play with him. But what helped me was like really sort of using the sort of like sports, like looking at like working in production, totally like it's just like a team oriented like
Uh-huh.
sports, like a dumb dad sports analogy, where I'm like, oh shit, I'm playing on the basketball team. I'm like the bench. Yeah, I'm the first guy off the bench, maybe, or maybe I'm like, the dude who's only supposed to rebound, whatever it is, got to help the team get to its goal, you know, let go of your ego, like just give yourself up to the mission, don't be a dick.
Mm,
And yeah, whatever. If you're sort of like signing on and agreeing to like work on this like show, it's sort of like an invisible contract where you're like agreeing to like help that show achieve its goals. The person who hired you is like your team captain. So you know, don't be an entitled like dork and use this as a forum to kind of
right.
like vent your insecurities. It's like, hey, let's try to get this show done on time and keep it looking good and keep morale high too,
Right.
like team chemistry, the locker room, all that stuff, all those dumb like sports terms, like those apply, I feel like, to a show production.
Yeah.
And Yeah, I had that revelation like a year or two ago where I was like, oh yeah, what if I treated it like it was like being part of a ball club or
Yeah, but
something?
also you have an outlet for your ego. You can be a team player there because you are able to write and draw what you want in your own comics.
That helps.
Because
Yeah.
if you didn't have that outlet, it would probably be that's probably where the contradictions in your own head would start to like bump up against each other, or the ego would start to manifest and be like,
Yeah.
no, I want to do this.
Yeah, yeah, it's hard. You have to. I mean, even if you don't have like comics or whatever, like you have to have some sort of outlet for yourself if you're an artist working
Yeah,
in, corporate product.
yeah.
Yeah.
But I would venture, at least from my own experience and from experiences of friends and loved ones, that when say the job is taking up all your time and you don't have time for that other stuff, that where you get to be yourself or get to put your own ego into these things, is that's when the tension starts happening. That's when the
Oh yeah.
frustration starts to leak in.
Yeah, time becomes sort of the big yeah, the precious sort of commodity that you're always fighting for. But it's okay. I mean, you just got to make those sacrifices and be disciplined. I mean, I'm not always like as disciplined as I would want to be, but I haven't played a video game in maybe like four
Oh,
years, just because there's no time.
sure.
Yeah, there's not a whole lot of time. Like if I do have free time, I'm trying to work on comics or some sort of personal project.
Yeah.
Um, as much as I can. I mean, obviously, I'm not like there's nights where I'm like I'm just so tired from the kids and from the day job that I'm just gonna like zone out and
Yeah.
watch like a movie or
Okay,
something.
last question then. I don't want to take up too much more of your time. You called yourself kind of a weirdo. You referred to that before. Was there a point in time where you accepted that as yourself, or were you always kind of fighting against that?
Yeah. Yeah, that's weird. Like that's for me, that's like I would have to kind of revisit my like sort of teen years when I was going through a lot of that angst. Yeah, maybe it was like around high school because I had a hard time making friends in high school. I had a lot of friends in like grade school up until eighth grade. So yeah, yeah, it was maybe around maybe my like junior year when I had fully like, oh yeah, now I'm like buying all these like indie comics. I'm listening to like more punk or grunge. I hate calling it grunge because back then you're just like, these are the bands I like. And I had made more friends. I had found friends or I had reconnected with friends that I had from like grade school. And they were weirdos too. So that at least was like sort of the beginning of the process of self-acceptance and also like just drawing
Mm.
more, not having any sort of like goal or direction in mind when I was like making art back then, but at least like, you know, practicing and just having some sort of outlet for whatever creative urge I had at the moment. That helped. And yeah, I think after that it just was like a sort of, like a continual sort of
Uh-huh.
acceptance of being, kind of like different. Yeah, it's also like in my family, I was like the only sort of like kind of weird guy or weird cousin. All my other cousins were like, into sports and or academic or going to the club or cars or something. And I was the only one that wasn't. So they all, I was still accepted as a family member. It was just like I was just the one that they couldn't quite like figure out. Like, oh, is Johnny gay? Like, is he like we can't quite, does he have a girlfriend? What are all these like weird comics that he's reading all the time or this like odd music or, why does he wear his hair that way? It's just more like questions, but luckily never like, they never ostracized me or
Okay, so
anything.
you still had that as a basis. You still had a kind of like acceptance that was there at the core. So you never felt totally alienated.
Luckily, yeah, yeah. Now that you bring it up, I mean, because there's a lot of artists and a lot of like truly weird kids that don't have that, like that kind of level of acceptance at home. So yeah, luckily I was given the space, to just sort of like figure out my own, you know, deal, but I never felt like rejected or, yeah, alienated in that way.
John, that seems like a very nice place to end. Thank you for joining me today on this
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having
very
me.
hot day in Los Angeles. Not as hot as yesterday, but still hot.
Yeah, it's getting cooler. Thank God for AC.
Not in this office at the moment.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, we have window units, so I turned everything off so that it wouldn't be on the background of the mic. So
For
I
the
am
noise.
sweating.
Oh man, the sacrifices you make for your art.
Thank you for recognizing it. Thank you. Thank you. And thanks again for joining me.
Yeah, no problem.
And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye, oh, 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 bye.